I want to cut past the mock draft scorecards and the initial reaction takes and talk about what the Cleveland Browns actually just communicated through the decisions they made across this draft. Because when you evaluate these selections against what we've been tracking for months, the picture that forms is more deliberate and more coherent than most of the early coverage is acknowledging. This wasn't a collection of individually interesting picks assembled without a unifying logic. This was an organizational statement expressed through resource allocation about exactly what this franchise understands needs to happen for Shedeur Sanders to become what his talent suggests he can be. Let me walk through it carefully. Pick 6. Spencer Fono, left tackle. The right call, the necessary call, and the reasoning behind it is the same reasoning that's been in this conversation since the offseason began. We've talked at length about the quality cliff in this tackle class after the top tier, about why teams that try to manufacture a solution at the position later in the draft are gambling with infrastructure they have the assets to secure early. Fono is exactly the kind of presence whose profile doesn't just improve the depth chart numbers. At 6'6", over 310 pounds, with the mobility to handle speed rushers on the edge and the hand strength to neutralize power moves inside, he changes what a quarterback can actually do from a structural standpoint. The evaluation from people who studied his tape carefully describes an anchor presence that transforms an offensive line from a liability that quarterbacks have to compensate around into a foundation they can execute from. And when you're building a developmental environment around a quarterback who faced pressure on 39% of his dropbacks last season, the worst rate in the entire NFL, addressing that at the most foundational position on the offensive line isn't a preference. It's the first and most urgent correction available. Cleveland had the pick. They used it correctly. That decision will matter in October in ways that are specific and visible. The quarterback behind a functional left tackle processes differently than the quarterback who spent 2025 operating behind the most compromised protection in the league. The anticipation timing on intermediate throws, the willingness to hold the ball an extra beat while a route develops to its designed depth, the ability to work through a full progression without the panic release that constant pressure bakes into a young passer's mechanics. All of those things happen more naturally when the edge of the pocket isn't collapsing before the play has time to develop. Fono doesn't just add a player to a position. He changes the conditions of Shedeur's daily work. KC Conception is the pick in this draft class that I think is being most significantly undervalued in the initial coverage, and I want to make the case for him specifically because the numbers he produced at the college level tell a story that the relative lack of pre-draft hype around him simply doesn't represent honestly. More touchdowns than Jordan Tyson, more touchdowns than Carnell Tate, more touchdowns than My Lemon. 28 total touchdowns, with 1,000 yards from scrimmage and 10 touchdowns in 2 of his 3 college seasons. Sustained production across multiple seasons against varied competition. That pattern is the signal that actually translates most reliably to the professional level. Not a single breakout year in a favorable scheme, not a dominant performance in one game that generated highlight tape, but repeated output over time. That's what you're projecting forward when you draft a player with genuine confidence. What excites me most about Concepcion is the dimension that makes him immediately functional rather than a developmental project you're waiting on. He can operate in the quick game, screens, slants, quickouts, in a way that fits Shedeur's natural processing rhythm. He can threaten vertically in one-on-one situations, which creates the pre-snap coverage distribution decisions that open everything else underneath. And he contributes as a punt returner, which means his value to the roster is multidimensional and immediate, rather than contingent on earning a featured role. 6 feet, 200 pounds, the size to work outside with the quickness to create separation at intermediate depths. The same player functioning across multiple dimensions of contribution is exactly the kind of layered value that smart front offices find in the middle rounds. Cleveland found it here. Denzel Boston gives Shedeur's receiving core something that profiles differently in every meaningful way from what Conception brings, and that differentiation is the point. Where Conception creates through quickness, route precision, and the ability to produce in traffic, Boston brings the physical, imposing dimension that forces entirely different coverage decisions. A 6.4 receiver who wins jump ball situations on the outside changes the throwing geometry for a quarterback in ways that statistics can't fully capture. It opens windows and angles that simply don't exist when every target on the outside is similarly sized, and the defense can allocate coverage resources without having to honor a contested catch threat. The combination of Boston creating mismatches on the perimeter and Conception operating in the quick game and as a vertical option gives Shedeur distribution choices that his receiving group last season genuinely did not provide. The scheme becomes more varied because the personnel allows more variation. That's not abstract. It's specific functionality that shows up in what defenses are able to take away and what they have to leave available. Austin Barber in the third round is where I think the organizational message of this draft becomes impossible to misread. Cleveland identified offensive line as the structural problem that most directly prevented fair evaluation of their quarterback last season. They addressed it with premium capital at pick 6, and then they came back and addressed it again with mid-round capital in round 3. 2 picks, both on the offensive line, both pointed at the same documented failure. A quarterback taking hits and pressure at the worst rate in the league behind infrastructure that was never functional enough to evaluate him fairly. The front office's decision to commit 2 draft selections to correcting that failure is the clearest possible organizational signal about the relationship between those problems. They're not treating Shedeur Sanders' development as something that can be solved through coaching and scheme while leaving the structural deficiency intact. They're addressing the structure. 2 picks, both on the line. That's organizational conviction expressed through behavior rather than language. The McNeil-Warren safety selection is the defensive piece of this construction, and his specific profile matters in a way that connects directly to the complete organizational picture. 4 forced fumbles and 2 interceptions in his final college season describes a player with genuine playmaking instincts, someone who doesn't just play disciplined coverage, but actively creates opportunities that change field position and game flow. And the contribution of a ball-hawking safety accumulates across a season in ways that show up on the quarterback side of the ball as much as the defensive side. Every drive that starts at midfield because the defense forced a fumble or intercepted a pass is a drive where the offense doesn't need to execute a perfectly constructed full-field sequence to put points on the board. The possession starts with momentum built in. Short fields, favorable game scripts, drives that allow a young passer to operate with controlled confidence, rather than the desperate urgency that last season's context produced. All of that flows partially from a defense that creates opportunities. Cleveland drafted the player profile that generates those opportunities at a consistent rate. Todd Monken's press conference comments about the 4-quarterback room have been generating the wrong kind of concern in some corners of the coverage, and I want to address that directly because the misreading is significant. His framing was consistent with everything he's communicated all offseason. Competition is real. Depth charts are real. Rep distribution reflects where players actually stand on those depth charts, rather than treating everyone as equally positioned regardless of evidence. Taylor Green is a developmental addition whose specific athletic profile lends itself to specialized package situations, designed runs, wildcat elements, moments where his athleticism creates problems that a pure pocket passing competition doesn't generate. That kind of addition is roster construction and offensive flexibility. It doesn't introduce organizational ambiguity about the starting quarterback any more than a backup running back threatens the starter's job security. The building's direction has been consistent for months. A press conference about roster depth doesn't override what the practice structure, the rep distribution, the captain designation, and the locker room testimony have all been communicating with remarkable consistency. Read the whole body of evidence rather than any single statement in isolation. The overall picture of this draft, viewed as a collection of decisions that together express organizational philosophy and priority, is more coherent than the initial coverage has given it credit for. 2 offensive linemen addressing the protection conditions around the franchise quarterback. 2 receivers addressing the vertical threat and quick game dimensions of a receiving core that wasn't forcing defensive coordinators to make difficult pre-snap decisions. A defensive playmaker whose contribution mode, turnovers, forced fumbles, consistent field position creation, builds the favorable conditions that support offensive development over the course of a full season. Every single selection in this class traces back to a specific documented deficiency in the environment around Shedeur Sanders, and every selection represents a concrete, resource-backed step toward correcting it. That's not coincidence. That's organizational philosophy expressed through the choices made when premium assets were on the table and the front office decided specifically how to allocate them. The external reaction to this draft has been broadly positive in a way that I think reflects genuine quality rather than optimism bias. When analysts operating with different frameworks and different prior dispositions toward this franchise arrive at the same positive assessment independently, it usually means the decisions were actually good rather than any single perspective talking itself into agreement with its own assumptions. The consensus here is wider than Cleveland draft classes typically generate. Here is where I honestly land when I look at everything together. The organizational commitment to Shedeur Sanders that has been visible for months in operational decisions. The practice structure, the first group rep distribution, the captain designation before the competition was formally closed, the testimony from Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward speaking publicly with their names fully attached, the coaching staff's documented developmental investment including helmet cameras for processing analysis. That commitment just got backed by the most concrete form of organizational expression available. Premium draft capital deployed at the positions that most directly determine whether a young quarterback develops in a functional environment or a broken one. They addressed left tackle. They addressed the vertical threat on the outside. They came back for more offensive line depth in round 3. They selected a defensive playmaker who creates turnovers and field position advantages. The connection between the decisions and the specific needs they address is traceable and deliberate, and that specificity is itself a form of organizational communication that goes beyond anything said at a press conference. The Watson situation still requires formal resolution before the starting designation becomes official. Training camp will bring its own evaluations and adjustments and complications. The Bosa conversation, if it develops formally, would add the defensive identity dimension that makes the complete construction genuinely difficult to scheme against. Nothing in professional football is settled before execution converts intention into performance. But what just happened in Cleveland across this draft is the clearest organizational statement about what this franchise is trying to become and who they've decided to become it around. The capital was real. The needs were specific and documented. The selections address those needs with coherent, deliberate intention. And the quarterback at the center of it, the one who showed up to every voluntary session when showing up was optional, who posted 80% completions in 11-on-11 reps on day 1 of minicamp, who challenged the outside narrative directly while the organizational evidence was still accumulating, just watched his organization prove with its most valuable assets that the belief is not a talking point. It is not a narrative constructed for external consumption. It is operational. It is backed by picks. And in professional football, that distinction between belief as language and belief as action is quite literally the only distinction that matters.